The village of Little Hemsby had long prided itself on the serene predictability of its days. Tucked between rolling green hills and a winding river that caught the sun's morning reflection just so, it was the sort of place where neighbors knew one another by sight, and the sound of a distant horse-drawn cart was as ordinary as the church bell at noon. Yet, even in such quiet locales, human nature has its restless undercurrents, and on this particular summer afternoon, they began to stir with an unsettling insistence. The occasion was a garden party hosted by Mrs. Eleanor Fitzroy, a woman whose house had, for decades, represented a sort of social center for the village. Her estate, a stately brick manor surrounded by flower beds of roses, delphiniums, and the occasional stray foxglove, seemed an unlikely setting for anything more dangerous than misplaced gossip. Yet, as Miss Marple herself would later consider with mild surprise, even such gardens held their shadows. Mrs. Fitzroy had arranged her guests with meticulous care. The trellises were festooned with lanterns, casting a soft glow even before evening settled, and tables groaned under the weight of delicacies: scones, tiny sandwiches, and cakes iced with delicate floral patterns. The air carried the mingled fragrance of summer blooms and freshly cut grass. As the guests arrived, polite greetings were exchanged, umbrellas tucked under arms despite the fine weather, and the clink of china punctuated the gentle hum of conversation. Miss Marple, small and unassuming, had come on the quiet invitation of her friend, the ever-anxious vicar, Reverend Lionel Hargreaves, who insisted she keep him company. She walked with the measured pace of someone who had seen many seasons and many sorts of people. In her sharp yet kindly eyes, she observed patterns invisible to most: the subtle twitch of a lip when someone lied, the nervous tightening of a hand when guilt pressed close, the flutter of impatience masquerading as casual interest. Nearby, a cluster of villagers had gathered, their chatter a mixture of curiosity and mild rivalry. Young Peter and his sister, Clara Wainwright, darted among the flower beds, their laughter ringing like tiny bells. Mr. and Mrs. Aldridge, new residents from the city, surveyed the scene with a mixture of skepticism and delight, unsure how to navigate the delicate codes of village etiquette. And in the center of it all, Mrs. Fitzroy herself, regal in a pale blue dress, moved with the careful poise of someone accustomed to both admiration and scrutiny. Tea was served in staggered intervals, allowing conversation to drift from polite remarks to the inevitable local gossip. Miss Marple, seated near the edge of the gathering, paid polite attention to the words, yet registered more in what remained unsaid. She noticed, for instance, that Mr. Arnold, the local solicitor, seemed more interested in the positioning of the silver spoons than the scones. She saw Mrs. Pennington, a retired schoolteacher, glance repeatedly toward the Fitzroys' west wing, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though recalling some unpleasant memory. It was then that the first disruption occurred, subtle at first, a sound that could have been ignored had one not listened closely. A raised voice, abrupt and sharp, pierced the calm. "I won't have it said in my house," Mrs. Fitzroy exclaimed, her tone trembling between anger and panic. Heads turned, some startled, some merely curious, toward the source, the French windows leading into the main hall. A moment later, Mr. Philip Carrington, a man known for his occasional temper and flamboyant gestures, stormed into view. His face, usually composed and smug, was flushed, his hands twisting the lapels of his jacket. "I tell you, Eleanor, this is utterly impossible. I cannot—" His words were cut off by a sudden, muffled scream from inside the house. The garden froze, china teetering on its saucers. Children ceased their laughter. Adults exchanged alarmed glances. Miss Marple, instinctively alert yet outwardly serene, stood slowly, her hand resting lightly on the edge of a trellis. From the doorway appeared Mrs. Fitzroy herself, pallid and shaken. It's Mr. Langley," she stammered. He's... Her words caught in her throat. A collective hush fell over the gathering. Whispers began to rise, but Miss Marple held up a small hand, almost unnoticed, and the voices quieted, sensing her quiet authority. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she scanned the crowd, not with suspicion yet, but with a quiet appraisal. She noted how Mr. Carrington's jaw clenched, how Mrs. Pennington's hands fidgeted with a lace handkerchief, how even the seemingly unperturbed children lingered near their parents, sensing the sudden tension. Each movement, each glance, each tiny alteration in the ordinary dance of manners was a note in a symphony of hidden truths. Inside, the hall was in mild chaos. Mr. Langley, the Fitzroys' distant relative who had arrived only that morning, lay slumped in the velvet armchair by the fireplace. His face, pale and strangely serene, betrayed none of the turmoil outside. The initial examination by the nearest doctor, summoned swiftly by Mrs. Fitzroy, hinted at something untoward, but offered little in the way of explanation. Miss Marple, however, knew better than to be satisfied by appearances alone. She stepped quietly inside, her small frame almost invisible amidst the crowd that had gathered at the threshold. The scent of polished wood and lingering tea filled the room. She allowed her gaze to drift casually over the scene, noting the subtle details. The tilt of a picture frame, the slightly ajar drawer of the writing desk, the faint, almost imperceptible smear on the polished floorboards. All would be dismissed by others as trivial, but to Miss Marple they whispered secrets if one knew how to listen. Returning to the garden, she allowed herself a small private smile. In Little Hemsby, where everything seemed as predictable as the sunrise, a disruption had occurred, and disruptions, she had long observed, rarely arose from nothing. Somewhere among these gathered villagers, hidden beneath layers of politeness and social custom, lay a motive, and it was her task, quietly and without fanfare, to uncover it. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the rose beds, and in that shifting light, the serene garden seemed suddenly unfamiliar. The village of Little Hemsby had been shaken, its calm surface broken, and Miss Marple, with her gentle yet unyielding curiosity, began to take her first quiet steps toward understanding the secret kept by candlelight. By the following morning, Little Hemsby was abuzz with speculation, as villages are wont to be when the familiar is disturbed by the unfamiliar. The incident at Mrs. Fitzroy's garden party had spread like wildfire, each retelling embroidered with small exaggerations, added emotion, and the occasional outright invention. One might have thought a minor war had broken out, considering the intensity of discussion over tea tables, kitchen sinks, and the churchyard gates. Miss Marple, seated in her tidy sitting room with a cup of chamomile tea, listened to the distant hum of conversation drifting through the window, as well as the occasional muttered remark from the postman, who seemed to take it upon himself to serve as village newswire. She noted with quiet interest how quickly suspicion had fallen upon various individuals, and how readily people were willing to believe the worst of those they professed to like. At the village bakery, Mrs. Tilling, whose gossiping proclivities were rivaled only by her skill at icing a fruit tart, had taken it upon herself to create a comprehensive theory of the crime. "It's obvious," she whispered, lowering her voice, though she was surrounded by customers, "that it must have been someone with old grievances. Mr. Carrington, of course," he was arguing so fiercely with Mrs. Fitzroy. "Anyone could see his temper." Mrs. Tilling's pronouncement was met with nods from the local ladies, although Mr. Hammond, the grocer, shook his head. "I don't know," he said slowly, scratching the back of his neck. "It's all too sudden, too convenient. I've been thinking, perhaps it's someone from outside the village. Someone who knew the house well, maybe during the renovations last year." Miss Marple had visited the bakery earlier in the morning, ostensibly to purchase a loaf of rye, but her real purpose had been to listen. She noted the way Mrs. Tilling's hands trembled ever so slightly as she handled the bread, the way Mr. Hammond's eyes darted toward the doorway whenever a customer arrived. Human nature, she reflected, was always in motion, even when people believed themselves still. Back at the vicarage, Reverend Hargreaves, naturally eager to understand and perhaps control the situation, had convened a small assembly of concerned villagers. The gathering included Mrs. Pennington, whose knowledge of past scandals was encyclopedic, Miss Clara Wainwright, whose curiosity often outran her discretion, and Mr. Aldridge, the city newcomer still struggling to comprehend the subtleties of village life. "Well," said the vicar, clearing his throat, "we must approach this rationally. There is no need for undue panic, though naturally we wish to understand who—" He paused, noticing Miss Marple's serene expression. Who could commit such an act? Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly, allowing the discussion to proceed without interruption. She did not rush to assign blame. That was never her method. Instead, she observed the behaviors surrounding her. Mr. Aldridge fidgeted, smoothing down his jacket and peering around as if the very walls might reveal the perpetrator. Mrs. Pennington's eyes gleamed, sharp and calculating, as she asked pointed questions that seemed designed to draw guilt from others, though she herself gave nothing away. Children were, as always, a special lens for human behavior. Peter and Clara Wainwright had been gently admonished by their mothers to keep their distance from the house where Mr. Langley had been found. Yet Miss Marple noticed how the boy lingered near the edge of the vicarage garden, occasionally glancing over his shoulder, and how Clara, pretending to admire the flowers, cast curious looks at the adults. Children, she thought, often sense more than they are allowed to express. Their small instincts are rarely distorted by social propriety. The village postman, Mr. Doyle, had been particularly active, visiting every house to ensure he had heard the latest versions of events. At the King's Arms Inn, he relayed to a small assembly of patrons the details he had picked up. Mr. Langley had been a distant relative of the Fitzroys, arriving unexpectedly. He had argued briefly with Philip Carrington during the garden party. Mrs. Fitzroy herself appeared distressed beyond what one would expect from mere social embarrassment. Each fact, however mundane, Miss Marple noted with care. One minor inconsistency, the time Mr. Langley was seen leaving the West Wing versus when the argument had occurred, nagged quietly at the edge of her mind. By mid-morning, a parade of conjectures had begun to emerge. Mrs. Tilling suggested it was the work of a jealous sibling. Mr. Hammond suspected a financial dispute. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Hargreaves, whispered that perhaps it was a matter of romantic jealousy. Each theory carried an air of conviction, yet Miss Marple detected the gaps, the slips of detail that suggested not one but many motives overlapping and entangling themselves, like the vines on Mrs. Fitzroy's trellises. Miss Marple walked slowly through the village that afternoon, exchanging polite greetings, nodding at familiar faces, and allowing her mind to work quietly. She noticed small signs, a muddy footprint on a doorstep, a thread of fabric snagged on a fence, the faint scent of cigars where none should have been. To the casual observer, these were trivial, incidental. To Miss Marple, they were threads in a tapestry slowly revealing its pattern. By evening, the village had settled into a restless curiosity, the chatter no longer mere speculation, but a communal obsession. Each resident had taken on the role of detective, theorist, or witness, yet few had paused to consider the truth that might lie beneath appearances. Miss Marple, seated in her favorite chair with a fresh pot of tea beside her, reflected on the ease with which people deceived themselves, and how, often, their own behavior betrayed them far more than any evidence of crime. She knew that understanding a crime required more than watching for obvious signs. It required listening, observing, and most importantly, understanding the nature of those involved. And in Little Hemsby, where everyone believed their actions unnoticed, she suspected that the truth had already begun to reveal itself in the smallest of gestures, in the quietest of moments, waiting for the patient observer to notice. The village had reacted, gossip had flourished, and suspicion had spread like morning mist over the hills. Yet the mystery was only beginning. Miss Marple, serene and vigilant, prepared herself for the subtle work that lay ahead, knowing that each villager, in their very ordinariness, held a key to the secrets kept by candlelight. The morning after the garden party, Little Hemsby found itself under the measured scrutiny of the local police. Sergeant Wilkinson, a competent officer with a methodical approach, arrived at Mrs. Fitzroy's estate with a notebook and a certain brisk efficiency. His presence brought a mixture of relief and apprehension to the villagers, for while his arrival signaled official action, it also heralded the uncomfortable exposure of private affairs. Miss Marple, as was her custom, arrived shortly after the sergeant, ostensibly to offer her assistance to the distressed Mrs. Fitzroy. She was met with a flurry of nervous activity, maids fussing over tea trays, Mr. Carrington pacing impatiently, and Mrs. Pennington scrutinizing every movement with sharp eyes. Miss Marple, however, appeared perfectly composed, her small figure moving through the room with unobtrusive grace. Sergeant Wilkinson began by questioning those present at the garden party, systematically noting statements and cross-referencing times. His questions were straightforward. Where were you when Mr. Langley was last seen? Did you notice anyone behaving unusually? Are there any disputes of which you are aware? Villagers offered their recollections, some precise, others muddled by anxiety or social tact. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, observed with gentle patience. She noticed the way Mr. Carrington's fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, betraying his irritation at being subjected to questioning. Mrs. Pennington, ostensibly calm, had her lips pressed into a thin line, betraying barely suppressed eagerness to assert her knowledge. Even the children, drawn by the promise of curiosity, lingered nearby, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and fascination. The sergeant appeared satisfied with the initial round of statements, yet Miss Marple's attention was drawn not to what was said, but to what was omitted. Mr. Aldridge, the newcomer, had recounted seeing Mr. Langley in the West Wing shortly before the argument, yet he neglected to mention having passed through that corridor alone moments later. The omission was slight, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple's keen mind registered it immediately. She also observed Mrs. Fitzroy herself, the hostess whose composure had begun to waver under scrutiny. She moved with careful precision, smoothing tablecloths and rearranging teacups, as though the act of arranging objects could restore a sense of control. Yet her eyes betrayed concern, flicking repeatedly toward the hall where Mr. Langley had been found. Miss Marple filed away these small gestures, understanding that anxiety often left traces more revealing than words. Later, when the sergeant retired to review his notes, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Fitzroy quietly. "It is a trying thing," she murmured gently, "when a household is disrupted in such a manner. Perhaps you can tell me more of Mr. Langley's habits while he was here. Anything you thought peculiar?" Mrs. Fitzroy hesitated, smoothing her hands over the fabric of her dress. He was quiet, mostly," she replied. "Polite, yes. But he seemed distracted, almost preoccupied. I thought it the heat, or perhaps travel fatigue. But now, I wonder, perhaps it was something more." Miss Marple nodded, accepting the answer while noting what remained unspoken. Mr. Langley had arrived unexpectedly, with little explanation for his sudden visit, and his behavior, though outwardly polite, had exhibited subtle signs of tension. A small, almost invisible clue had begun to emerge, the intersection of opportunity and motive, hidden behind the polite masks of social civility. Outside, the villagers gathered once again, their conversations tinged with apprehension. Rumors flourished. Some suggested a dispute over an inheritance. Others speculated on an old family quarrel resurfacing. Miss Marple, listening with quiet intent, allowed the theories to pass, noting how people's own biases shaped their perceptions. Mrs. Tilling, ever eager to assert her insight, declared with confidence that Mr. Carrington's temper made him guilty, while Mr. Hammond argued that such a crime could only be committed by an outsider. Each argument contained partial truths, yet all overlooked subtle details that only careful observation could uncover. Miss Marple decided to make her own rounds, walking slowly through the Fitzroy estate and adjoining gardens. She noticed the faint marks on the lawn where someone had lingered longer than they claimed, the slightly ajar window of the west wing, and a smudge on the polished floorboards that suggested hurried movement. These details, overlooked by all but the most attentive observer, began to weave a story separate from the villagers' speculation. Her next visit was to the local inn, where Mr. Doyle, the postman, had gathered a small audience of curious patrons eager to share their versions of the tale. Miss Marple, ordering only a pot of tea, allowed the discussion to flow around her. She noted how Mrs. Aldridge, uneasy in a village setting, carefully avoided eye contact with several locals, and how young Clara Wainwright, seemingly innocuous, displayed flashes of sly curiosity that hinted at deeper awareness than her years would suggest. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the Fitzroy estate, where Sergeant Wilkinson was preparing to conduct a more formal search of the house. She observed the careful method with which he approached the task, appreciating his diligence while recognizing that he, like most, would place undue emphasis on tangible evidence. Human behavior, she reflected, often left clues far more telling than footprints or fingerprints. In the sitting room, she quietly examined the positions of the chairs, the arrangement of the small side tables, and the subtle disarray of papers on the writing desk. One small envelope, tucked behind a book of poetry, caught her attention. Its contents, a brief note with a few penciled words, seemed innocuous to anyone else, yet Miss Marple sensed it was connected to the tension that had flared during the garden party. As evening approached, the estate settled into an uneasy quiet. Villagers departed, leaving only the household staff and the Fitzroys to grapple with the day's events. Miss Marple, seated once again near the hearth, reflected on what she had seen. Opportunity, motive, and the human tendency toward secrecy were all present, yet the precise pattern remained elusive. She understood, as she often did in such cases, that the truth lay not in hurried accusations, but in patient attention to subtle signs. A gesture, a hesitation, a glance that lingered too long. The early investigation had revealed facts, certainly, but Miss Marple knew that facts alone did not tell the full story. To uncover the truth of what had happened that fateful afternoon, one needed to watch, to listen, and to perceive the invisible threads that bound human behavior together. And in Little Hemsby, where everyone believed their actions unnoticed, Miss Marple had already begun to see the edges of a pattern that, if followed carefully, would reveal the secret kept by candlelight. By the morning following the early investigation, the village of Little Hemsby had already begun to form its own conclusions. The whispers that had started as tentative speculation now carried a note of certainty, as if repetition lent legitimacy. Among the villagers, one figure seemed to bear the brunt of suspicion, Mr. Philip Carrington. It was hardly surprising, given his behavior at the garden party. Witnesses described his heated argument with Mrs. Fitzroy, his flushed face, and the force of his gestures, which suggested anger untempered by discretion. Sergeant Wilkinson, diligent yet perhaps too eager to resolve the case swiftly, had already indicated that Mr. Carrington was the primary focus of his inquiry. The police, Miss Marple noted with quiet observation, often succumbed to the allure of the obvious suspect, especially when social appearances seemed to point so directly toward him. Mr. Carrington, for his part, bore the scrutiny with a mixture of indignation and defensiveness. He arrived at the Fitzroy estate that morning, ostensibly to offer assistance, though his eyes betrayed irritation at being treated as a suspect. "This is absurd," he exclaimed when confronted by Sergeant Wilkinson. "I had a disagreement, yes, but murder, preposterous. I assure you I had nothing to do with Mr. Langley's misfortune." Miss Marple, seated in the corner of the drawing-room, regarded him silently. She noticed the slight twitch of his left eye, the momentary tightening of his jaw when his words were questioned. To most observers, these were signs of anger, yet to Miss Marple they were merely the ordinary signals of a man unused to being scrutinized, of a temperament trying to maintain its usual authority under pressure. Outside the drawing-room windows, the village continued its careful observation. Mrs. Tilling had stationed herself on the doorstep of the inn with binoculars, reporting back every movement of Mr. Carrington and anyone else who approached the estate. Miss Marple reflected on the human fascination with drama. It seemed that the majority preferred the comfort of a neat explanation, even if it was incomplete or false, to the patience required to observe the truth. Sergeant Wilkinson pressed his questions with methodical consistency. "Where were you immediately after the argument, Mr. Carrington?" he asked. "Did anyone see you?" "I remained in the garden," Carrington replied, his tone a mixture of defensiveness and forced calm. "I spoke with several people. Ask them yourselves." He gestured vaguely toward the estate grounds, as if the simple act of pointing might suffice as evidence of his innocence. Miss Marple, however, noticed subtleties that others overlooked. Carrington's account, while plausible, was careful in its phrasing as if rehearsed. The placement of his hands, resting lightly on the back of a chair rather than relaxed at his sides, suggested tension. The slight hesitation before answering certain questions hinted at awareness of matters he did not fully reveal. While these were not indications of guilt, they were threads Miss Marple filed away for later consideration. The villagers, meanwhile, had begun to act as their own informal jury. Mrs. Pennington, seated in a nearby armchair with knitting in her lap, offered running commentary. "Mark my words," she whispered to anyone who would listen. "He had motive enough. Temper like his. Anyone could predict an outburst. I would not be surprised if the truth were worse than we think." Young Clara Wainwright, who had followed her brother Peter into the garden earlier, seemed captivated by the unfolding drama. "Do you think he really did it?" she asked her mother, her wide eyes reflecting both fear and fascination. Her mother, uneasy, simply shook her head, though she made no move to shield Clara from the spectacle. Miss Marple, observing from a nearby window, noted the child's absorbing attention. Children, she knew, often perceived the incongruities adults tried to hide, and Clara's focus suggested she had already picked up on details the adults missed. Even Mr. Aldridge, still adjusting to village life, contributed his own conjectures. "I've read of cases like this in London," he said, speaking to the vicar, Reverend Hargreaves. "Usually, the obvious suspect is the guilty party, particularly when there is public dispute. I would not be surprised if the police are correct in focusing on Mr. Carrington." Miss Marple allowed him to speak without interruption, her mind quietly evaluating each opinion. She understood the power of expectation. Once a community had settled on a likely culprit, it tended to ignore evidence that contradicted the narrative. This, she reflected, was the precise reason she preferred patient observation to hasty judgment. The sergeant conducted a cursory search of Mr. Carrington's possessions and found nothing immediately incriminating. Nevertheless, his manner suggested satisfaction that the primary suspect had been identified, and he allowed the villagers to sense a tentative conclusion. Many nodded, comforted by what seemed like progress. The illusion of certainty, Miss Marple thought, was almost as potent as the truth itself. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. While Carrington's temperament and behavior were conspicuous, they were not proof of murder. The argument at the garden party, she reflected, could just as easily have been an ordinary quarrel, intensified by the presence of witnesses and the natural human desire to assert oneself publicly. The true puzzle, she knew, lay elsewhere, in the minor inconsistencies, the overlooked gestures, and the subtle signs that no one else had deemed significant. As the day wore on, she continued her quiet observations, noting the placement of objects in the drawing room, the faint marks on the floor, and the manner in which Carrington interacted with both the household and the visitors. Each detail added to the tapestry of human behavior she was beginning to assemble. While the village had embraced a neat conclusion, Miss Marple understood that appearances were rarely so simple. By evening, the focus on Mr. Carrington had solidified in public opinion. The sergeant was content, the villagers reassured, and Carrington himself maintained a controlled composure, though it was clear he felt the strain. Miss Marple, unperturbed, sipped her tea and reflected on the day. She had no doubt that further investigation would reveal subtleties that could not be explained by temper alone, and that the first suspect, though convenient, was unlikely to be the true culprit. In Little Hemsby, the search for the truth had begun in earnest, yet the real mystery, the secret kept by candlelight, remained hidden, waiting for the patient observer to recognize its delicate patterns amidst the distractions of gossip, temperament, and the human tendency toward assumption. By the third day following the garden party, Little Hemsby had settled into a state of restless observation. Villagers continued to discuss Mr. Langley's fate in hushed tones, each retelling more vivid than the last, and the Fitzroy estate remained under quiet surveillance. Sergeant Wilkinson's presence had become routine, his notebook always at hand, and his questions carefully timed to maintain authority while avoiding disruption. Yet despite all official measures, Miss Marple understood that the most telling details were never the ones immediately obvious. It was in this environment of meticulous scrutiny and social tension that she first noticed what everyone else overlooked: a tiny mark on the parquet floor of the west wing, a faint scuff just beneath the edge of a Persian rug. To any casual observer, it would have appeared trivial, a sign of age, a minor abrasion from furniture. Yet Miss Marple, pausing to examine it more closely, perceived that its placement suggested movement that had gone unnoticed by others. Someone had paused there, briefly but decisively, and the mark was the only evidence of that moment. She crouched, her fingers brushing lightly over the subtle abrasion. It was not deep, and yet it told a story of urgency, of a foot shifting weight unevenly, of hesitation mingled with intent. Miss Marple made a mental note. This detail, trivial as it seemed, might hold the key to understanding the precise sequence of events. Her attention was then drawn to a small envelope that had escaped notice during the earlier search of the room. It was tucked behind a book on the writing desk, a slender, unassuming envelope, sealed but unaddressed. Most visitors would have passed it by, but Miss Marple's eyes, trained for these subtleties, immediately registered its potential significance. Carefully, she picked it up, noting its weight and texture. The paper was fine, the sort used for personal correspondence. With a practiced discretion, she opened it slightly to glimpse the contents. A brief note, written in hurried, uneven script, almost as though the writer had been interrupted mid-thought. The words themselves were nondescript, mentioning only a meeting and a promise to disclose certain information later. Yet the urgency and concealment suggested that the writer had feared discovery, or perhaps mistrusted the intentions of others in the house. Miss Marple leaned back, letting her gaze drift over the rest of the room. The writing desk itself bore signs of recent disturbance. A faint smudge on the polished surface, the tilt of a blotter, the misalignment of a set of papers. Together with the mark on the floor and the hidden envelope, these details suggested a moment of private urgency, occurring away from the observation of the larger gathering in the garden. She stepped back into the corridor, observing the alignment of furniture and the faint impressions on the carpet from where chairs had been moved. The sequence was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it painted a picture of movement and intention that no one else had noticed. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Often, she reflected, the simplest clues were those most easily overlooked precisely because they did not fit the grand gestures of suspicion. Outside, the village continued its chatter, the focus still firmly on Mr. Carrington. Mrs. Tilling had begun compiling a mental list of evidence against him, ignoring minor details that did not conform to her preferred narrative. Mr. Hammond, convinced that the truth lay with some outsider, disregarded the patterns forming quietly within the house. Miss Marple, observing from the shadows, understood that the real story was seldom told by those who shouted the loudest or gestured most dramatically. In the afternoon, she wandered again through the Fitzroy gardens, pretending casual interest in the roses while her mind worked over the details she had collected. The mark on the floor, the envelope, the slight disturbances on the desk, all were fragments, incomplete on their own, yet suggestive of a sequence. Someone had moved in secrecy, someone who understood the importance of concealment. And in every subtle sign, Miss Marple detected the faintest whisper of human anxiety, the hesitation, the uncertainty, the ever-present fear of being discovered. Returning inside, she carefully replaced the envelope behind the book, ensuring it would appear untouched to casual eyes. Miss Marple knew that revealing it too soon would alert others, potentially altering behavior and destroying the trace of truth she intended to follow. Patience, she reminded herself, was as essential as observation in matters such as these. Her mind then turned to the relationships between those present at the garden party. Mr. Carrington's temper, though conspicuous, explained nothing beyond ordinary disagreement. Yet the note suggested someone else had motive enough to conceal a message or prevent its contents from being discovered. The urgency implied in the script aligned poorly with the assumption of immediate rage, hinting at a deeper layer of premeditation or at least calculated opportunity. Miss Marple also considered the children. Peter and Clara Wainwright, though innocently absorbed in their play, had been witnesses to subtle interactions that adults missed. She reflected on how often the truth was reflected in the smallest, seemingly unimportant observations. The glance exchanged between adults, the minor hesitation in speech, or the manner in which someone positioned themselves in a room. Each behavior, when carefully noted, contributed to an understanding that surpassed superficial appearances. Even as the villagers focused on the more dramatic elements, the argument, the evident anger, the visible disturbances, Miss Marple traced the quieter narrative. The hidden envelope and the faint floor mark were like whispers of a conversation never spoken aloud, subtle indicators that the story was not as simple as outward appearances suggested. The real tension, she sensed, was beneath the surface, where human nature, secrecy, and fear intersected. As the evening approached, the house grew quiet. The Fitzroys retired to their private rooms, and the household staff carried out their duties with conscientious efficiency. Miss Marple, standing in the soft glow of a table lamp, allowed herself one last reflection before departing. The hidden clue was not proof on its own, nor did it point directly to guilt, yet it illuminated a path through which the truth might be uncovered. She understood, as always, that patience and attentive observation would reveal what speculation and assumption could not. In Little Hemsby, the village remained caught up in surface drama, but the careful observer had already glimpsed the first subtle signs of the story beneath: a minor scuff, a concealed note, and the delicate traces of human anxiety. The secret kept by candlelight was beginning to show its outline, though the final image was still distant, awaiting the patient unraveling that only Miss Marple could provide. By the fourth day, the tension in Little Hemsby had taken on a palpable weight. The initial flurry of gossip had settled into a more focused scrutiny of one another, and Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction how human nature inevitably revealed itself when people were placed under pressure. In the Fitzroy estate, the household had begun to feel the strain. Doors were closed more often than open, voices lowered, and even the smallest gestures carried a hint of self-consciousness. It was Mrs. Pennington who first stirred the revelations, perhaps unintentionally. She had come calling at the Fitzroy residence under the pretext of offering support, but in her usual incisive manner, she began to inquire about past disagreements among the villagers. "I always thought it curious," she murmured to Mrs. Fitzroy, "how certain people's tempers flare under duress. It reminds one of incidents long past, little disputes never quite forgotten. People carry grudges like small stones in their pockets, don't they?" Mrs. Fitzroy, uneasy, allowed herself a small nod, though she offered little else. Miss Marple, observing silently from her corner, noted the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. The hostess was aware of more than she would readily confess, and Miss Marple, as always, understood that the unspoken often spoke louder than words. It was not long before other villagers contributed their own perspectives, each revealing small but significant details. Mr. Carrington, whose temperament had drawn suspicion, admitted that he had once quarrelled over estate boundaries with Mr. Langley years prior. The argument had been brief, quickly settled, yet it provided the perfect seed for suspicion to grow in the fertile soil of rumour. Miss Marple noted the careful way he spoke. There was a mixture of truth and strategic understatement, as though he intended to reveal only what was necessary to maintain credibility. In contrast, the newcomer, Mr. Aldridge, revealed a history of minor disputes with local tradesmen, a fact that had previously been unknown. He had arrived in Little Hemsby from London only months before, ostensibly seeking peace and quiet, yet his interactions suggested subtle friction that might go unnoticed by casual observers. Miss Marple made a mental note. Friction, when combined with opportunity, could serve as motive, even if unconnected to the immediate crime. Young Clara Wainwright, curious and perceptive, provided a surprising insight during one of the afternoon gatherings. While playing near the rose bushes, she had noticed Mr. Langley retreating briefly to the west wing just before the argument, clutching an envelope that matched the one Miss Marple had discovered. Clara's innocent observation confirmed the significance of the hidden note and hinted at secret communications that were yet to be fully understood. Miss Marple began to weave these disparate threads together, carefully considering the interplay of motive, opportunity, and concealed emotion. It became clear that the garden party, while outwardly ordinary, had been a crucible for tensions long simmering beneath the surface. The villagers' polite facades masked resentments that, though seemingly trivial, carried the potential for drastic action under the right circumstances. The household staff, too, contributed to the revelation of secrets, often inadvertently. The butler, Mr. Higgins, noted that Mr. Langley had seemed particularly interested in the Fitzroy wine cellar the night before the gathering, a fact he had initially dismissed as curiosity. The housekeeper, Mrs. Darby, mentioned overhearing a quiet conversation between Mr. Langley and Mrs. Fitzroy in the early morning, the subject of which was vague but urgent. Each small detail added layers to the tapestry of human behavior that Miss Marple began to see clearly, though the connections remained subtle. Conversations grew more pointed as the day progressed. Mr. Hammond, at the inn, remarked on the old rivalries among the villagers, noting, with some emphasis, that certain resentments had been passed down for generations. "You never know what festers quietly," he said, stirring his tea absent-mindedly. "Small disputes overlook slights. They linger until something brings them to light." Miss Marple, overhearing this, reflected on how resentment often remained invisible to the casual observer, yet was keenly felt by those involved. Sergeant Wilkinson attempted to impose order on these emerging revelations, taking notes and occasionally requesting clarification. Yet even he could not suppress the human tendency toward embellishment or selective disclosure. Miss Marple, as always, relied not on the spoken word alone, but on the subtle inconsistencies that betrayed genuine emotion. A glance held too long, a hesitation before speaking, the almost imperceptible tightening of a hand, all were evidence in her mind of thoughts unvoiced. By evening, the villagers were gathered once more at the Fitzroy drawing-room. Mrs. Fitzroy, attempting to maintain composure, had invited a few trusted neighbors for tea, hoping to restore a semblance of civility. Yet even in this controlled setting, tensions surfaced. Mrs. Pennington, wielding her incisive curiosity like a scalpel, pressed gently yet insistently for details, while Mr. Carrington bristled at questions he deemed intrusive. The atmosphere, though polite, was taut with unspoken awareness. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in a corner, allowed these interactions to unfold without interference. She noted how Mrs. Fitzroy's gaze lingered briefly on the closed door of the west wing, as though the secrets it contained were simultaneously known and feared. She observed Mr. Aldridge's subtle attempts to engage in conversation without revealing personal history, and she took careful note of the fleeting expressions of guilt, anxiety, and caution among the various villagers. The convergence of these revelations brought clarity to Miss Marple's understanding. Every resident had a secret, every interaction a potential motive. What was crucial, she reflected, was discerning which secrets were truly relevant to the crime and which were merely incidental reflections of human nature. The hidden envelope, the scuffed floor, the whispered conversations. Each was a piece of the puzzle, waiting for the proper alignment to reveal the full picture. As the evening drew to a close, the villagers departed, leaving the house calm once more. Miss Marple remained, her eyes scanning the room, noting the placement of objects and the residual energy of human tension. Confrontations and secrets had surfaced, creating a network of possibilities. Yet the true resolution, she knew, depended on careful observation, patient reflection, and the subtle unraveling of human behavior. In Little Hemsby, the garden party had revealed more than a single quarrel or argument. It had uncovered a lattice of concealed motives, old grievances, and understated rivalries. Miss Marple, ever observant, understood that the secret kept by candlelight was not yet fully revealed, but the edges of the truth were beginning to show. Each villager, through confrontation or confession, had contributed a thread, and the final tapestry of human intent would soon emerge in its entirety. The morning following the revelations of the previous day dawned crisp and clear, yet in Little Hemsby, clarity did not extend to the village's understanding of the mystery. Rumors continued to ripple like quiet currents through the narrow streets, each villager convinced they had discerned the truth. Yet Miss Marple, as always, remained patient, observing the ebb and flow of suspicion and noticing the small inconsistencies that everyone else overlooked. It was during breakfast at the Fitzroy estate that the first true shift occurred. The postman, Mr. Doyle, arrived with a letter addressed to Mrs. Fitzroy, the seal freshly broken. Its contents were brief but disquieting, a warning that any further inquiry into Mr. Langley's affairs could lead to consequences unpleasant enough to dissuade persistent curiosity. The note, unsigned, was the first clear evidence that someone sought to manipulate events from behind the scenes. The arrival of this letter immediately altered the villagers' focus. Mr. Carrington, already under suspicion, shifted nervously in his seat, as if the threat might be intended for him. Mrs. Pennington, ever eager to assert her insight, leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "It seems," she said, her voice tinged with satisfaction, "that there are others involved who do not wish their secrets revealed. Perhaps we have been looking in the wrong direction." Miss Marple, quietly pouring her tea, allowed the moment to pass without comment. She noted the reactions of each person at the table, the hesitation in Mr. Aldridge's voice when he was asked for his opinion, the fleeting glance Clara Wainwright cast toward the window, and the subtle tightening of Mrs. Fitzroy's hands on her napkin. Each small detail, seemingly innocuous, hinted at anxiety and potential culpability that had yet to surface fully. Later, when Sergeant Wilkinson arrived to continue his investigation, he was presented with an added complication. The envelope containing the cryptic note had vanished from its hiding place behind the book on the writing desk. The disappearance was noted with concern, and for a moment, suspicion shifted unpredictably across the household. Every individual now became both observer and observed, their movements carefully scrutinized for any hint of furtive action. Miss Marple, however, recognized the nature of the misdirection immediately. The missing envelope did not indicate guilt, but rather the awareness of someone who understood the importance of concealment. She reflected quietly that the true culprit often moved with a subtle hand, influencing perception without revealing their own intent. The letter at breakfast and the missing envelope together suggested a pattern. Someone was orchestrating events carefully, seeking to guide suspicion away from themselves. By midday, the village was in a state of heightened alert. Conversations, previously restrained by social niceties, had become more pointed, tinged with fear and conjecture. Mrs. Pennington declared with confidence that Mr. Hammond must know more than he was admitting, while Mr. Aldridge attempted to maintain a calm demeanor, though his hand trembled slightly as he lifted a cup of tea. Each observer, Miss Marple knew, provided inadvertent testimony through gestures, glances, and shifts in tone. The twist that cemented the day's tension arrived unexpectedly. A second minor incident occurred in the estate's west wing. A window, previously closed and latched, was discovered slightly ajar, as if someone had moved through it in secrecy. No footprints were visible outside, yet the faint drag of soil along the sill suggested that entry or exit had been executed with care. This discovery caused a ripple of unease. Villagers whispered of intruders, of secrets buried too deeply to remain hidden, and the police, diligent but uncertain, began to consider alternative scenarios. Miss Marple, surveying the scene with quiet attention, noted more than the open window. The faint traces of mud inside the room indicated a hurried movement, yet the absence of footprints elsewhere suggested that the intruder was careful, possibly familiar with the estate. More importantly, the placement of objects within the room had been subtly altered. The position of a chair, the angle of the writing desk, even the tilt of a decorative vase. These minor shifts, imperceptible to most, formed a narrative of human behavior, one that Miss Marple could interpret. Later, she spoke quietly with Clara Wainwright, who had been watching the household with wide, curious eyes. "Did you notice anything unusual yesterday?" Miss Marple asked gently. Clara thought for a moment, frowning. "I saw someone near the west wing window," she said, lowering her voice. "I don't think they saw me. They moved really fast, and they had something in their hand, like a note." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. The child's observation, innocent as it was, confirmed what she had suspected. There were movements deliberately hidden, interactions unseen by the adults, and small pieces of evidence that could easily be dismissed as inconsequential. In combination with the missing envelope and the threatening letter, it pointed toward a carefully managed deception. By evening, the household gathered once more. Miss Marple, knitting in her usual corner, watched the subtle exchanges among the adults. Mr. Carrington, still visibly irritated by suspicion, sought to maintain dignity through measured speech. Mr. Aldridge appeared outwardly calm, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern whenever the West Wing was mentioned. Mrs. Fitzroy's hands continued to betray her anxiety, even as she attempted to maintain composure for her guests. The twist of the day was clear. The crime was not the result of a single moment of anger or opportunity, as many had assumed. Rather, it was part of a careful orchestration, involving secrecy, misdirection, and an acute awareness of human behavior. Whoever had orchestrated these events understood the weight of perception, the power of suggestion, and the subtle ways in which suspicion could be guided and controlled. Miss Marple, as she reflected quietly, realized that the case had deepened. The first suspect, Mr. Carrington, remained a convenient target for public scrutiny, yet the emerging clues, the threatening letter, the missing envelope, the movement near the West Wing window, pointed to someone far more calculating. The true culprit, she suspected, was both patient and observant, manipulating the village's assumptions while concealing their own intentions. As the household settled for the night, the candlelight flickered across walls that seemed to hold their own secrets. Miss Marple, observing the subtle signs of tension in the residents' faces, understood that the hidden narrative was beginning to reveal itself. The twists of the morning had shifted the focus, yet the solution remained concealed, waiting for patient attention and careful deduction. In Little Hemsby, suspicion had been redirected and secrets had begun to stir in unexpected directions. Miss Marple, quiet and unassuming, smiled faintly to herself. The threads of deception were intricate, but she was beginning to see the patterns that would ultimately lead to the revelation of the secret kept by candlelight. The days following the discovery of the open window and the missing envelope carried a weighty hush over Little Hemsby. The villagers, their curiosity tinged with unease, tiptoed around the Fitzroy estate with half-formed theories and carefully measured questions. Yet Miss Marple, knitting quietly in her corner as always, knew that true understanding demanded more than idle speculation. It required observation, subtlety, and a gentle manipulation of human behavior to reveal truths that were otherwise concealed. It was during the early afternoon, while the sun cast a soft glow over the drawing room, that Miss Marple decided it was time to begin what she considered her final test. She would engage each suspect in conversation, allowing them to reveal themselves through words, gestures, and the smallest involuntary signs of tension. To the casual observer, her inquiries would appear as the idle musings of a kindly, elderly lady. To the astute, they were instruments of revelation. Her first subject was Mr. Carrington. She approached him while he examined the library shelves, ostensibly curious about his interest in rare books. "I noticed," she began softly, "that you have a particular fondness for historical accounts of disputes. Do you find that people rarely change, even over generations?" Carrington, taken slightly aback by the innocuous nature of her question, responded cautiously. "I suppose habits and tendencies do persist," he said, his voice even, though his hand brushed nervously over the spine of a leather-bound volume. "Old rivalries can linger, I admit, but that does not imply action beyond reason." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Of course, she murmured. Yet the careful placement of his hands, the subtle tension in his shoulders, and the slight avoidance of eye contact provided her with silent testimony. He was defensive, yes, but not in the manner of a guilty party. Rather, he displayed the predictable strain of a man under suspicion, aware that any misstep might confirm the villagers' assumptions. Next, she turned to Mr. Aldridge, who had been quietly sipping tea by the window. She inquired about his recent arrival in the village, commenting on how often newcomers had to navigate a delicate web of social connections. "It must be difficult," she said, "to understand the nuances of old friendships and rivalries so quickly. Do you ever feel at odds with the expectations of others?" Aldridge's eyes flickered with an expression Miss Marple recognized immediately. The slight, almost imperceptible twitch of unease that accompanied self-conscious reflection. I try to observe first," he replied, his tone careful, measured. "It is prudent, I think, to learn before speaking. The village has its rhythm, and one must respect it." Miss Marple smiled faintly, allowing her gaze to linger. "Ah, yes. Observation is often the wisest course. One notices what others overlook." Her words, innocuous in appearance, were designed to prod subtly. Aldridge's minor discomfort, she noted, was not evidence of guilt, but a sign of awareness that certain matters were under scrutiny. A caution she expected of anyone astute enough to notice the tension swirling around the estate. She then spoke with Mrs. Fitzroy, whose anxiety had been visible since the morning of the letter. In gentle tones, she mentioned the challenges of managing a household where secrets might ripple unseen beneath the surface. "It is curious," she said. How easily small events can magnify, how minor disagreements can leave lasting marks. Do you ever feel that certain matters require discretion above all else? Mrs. Fitzroy's hands tightened briefly around her teacup. Indeed, she admitted softly, voice tinged with unease. Some things are best kept quiet for the sake of everyone involved. Miss Marple allowed the pause to linger, noting the subtle hesitation before any elaboration, the faint pressure of tension in her shoulders. There was something in the phrasing, something that suggested knowledge of delicate matters she had not yet disclosed. Even the children provided insight. Clara Wainwright, curious and perceptive, noticed minute details that adults dismissed. Miss Marple engaged her gently, inquiring about what she had observed near the west wing window. Clara recounted with wide-eyed honesty the figure she had glimpsed moving swiftly, carrying what appeared to be a note. "They didn't see me," she whispered. "I think they didn't want anyone to know." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving threads between the innocent observations of the child, the anxious gestures of adults, and the subtle manipulations revealed in speech and movement. Each interaction was a test, and each test, when interpreted with care, brought the picture closer to clarity. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had begun to sense a pattern. The true perpetrator, she suspected, was not the obvious candidate, the man whose temper had drawn public attention, but someone far more calculated, someone who understood both the social landscape and the human inclination toward assumption. The final test, she realized, would require more than observation. It would require deliberate engagement to provoke the reaction that revealed hidden truth. To this end, she arranged a seemingly casual conversation with all the key suspects present in the drawing room under the pretext of discussing the garden party and its disruptions. She introduced topics carefully, allowing herself to appear tangential and whimsical, asking about flowers, minor quarrels, and the habits of certain villagers. Each question was designed to elicit responses revealing more than the surface words could convey. Miss Marple observed the reactions as one might watch the flow of a river, subtle ripples betraying unseen currents beneath the placid surface. Mr. Carrington continued his defensiveness, though predictable and transparent. Mr. Aldridge maintained measured composure, yet his eyes occasionally betrayed fleeting recognition of certain suggestions. Mrs. Fitzroy's tension remained, though contained, hinting at a careful control of emotions. And throughout, the child's wide, attentive gaze reflected the small but telling irregularities in behavior that adults assumed were unnoticed. As evening drew near and the candlelight flickered across the room, Miss Marple allowed her final question to fall like a gentle pebble into still water. It was innocuous in phrasing, yet layered with subtle implications. She noted the involuntary movements, the small hesitations, the fleeting flickers of recognition in eyes and hands. The pattern she had observed over days of careful scrutiny was beginning to solidify, revealing the outlines of human intention previously hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple, ever composed, leaned back in her chair, letting the test play out without interruption. The villagers were unwitting actors in a drama orchestrated by her subtle prompts, and as the candlelight flickered across their faces, she quietly acknowledged to herself that the final revelation was near, waiting only for the precise alignment of observation, inference, and human instinct. The following morning, a soft mist clung to the village of Little Hemsby, lending an almost ethereal quiet to the streets. Miss Marple, moving with her usual unassuming grace, arrived at the Fitzroy estate early, determined that the day would finally bring clarity. The hidden threads of suspicion, the subtle misdirections, and the small but telling behaviors she had observed over the past week were ready to converge into the revelation she had been awaiting. Miss Marple gathered the key villagers in the drawing room as one might arrange pieces of a puzzle for display. She began quietly, knitting in her corner while allowing her eyes to roam across the familiar faces, noting the smallest of movements, A tightening of hands, a flicker in the eyes, the faintest shift in posture. Her voice, gentle and unhurried, invited attention without demanding it. "My dear friends," she began, "we have all been concerned by recent events. The loss of Mr. Langley has unsettled this household and the village alike. Naturally, we each looked to the most obvious explanations, the persons whose temper or circumstances made suspicion convenient. Yet, as is often the case, the truth hides in subtle details, overlooked because they do not fit the most immediate assumptions." She paused, allowing her words to settle like dust over the room. Eyes widened, glances exchanged, but Miss Marple spoke as though recounting the weather or a village custom, not accusing anyone outright. "The first point to consider," she continued, "is Mr. Langley's behavior the day before the tragedy. He retreated to the west wing carrying a small envelope. A seemingly minor detail, but one that speaks volumes. The envelope, you may recall, was later discovered missing. A disappearance unnoticed by anyone but one careful observer." She let her gaze fall softly upon Mrs. Fitzroy, who shifted imperceptibly. "Next," Miss Marple said, "there was the letter delivered yesterday, warning against further inquiry. Its origin was anonymous, yet it demonstrated knowledge and concern over the consequences of discovery. This indicates deliberate orchestration, patience, and observation. The person behind this understood both the household and the village, and they used human behavior as a veil for their actions." She rose, moving slowly across the room, her voice still calm, her demeanor unchanged. "We have also noted minor disturbances in the west wing. The open window, the faint traces of movement, the slight adjustments of furniture, all subtle yet significant when considered together. These were not the actions of a person acting in haste or under sudden passion. They were deliberate, careful, and aware." The room was silent now, every pair of eyes fixed on her, every heartbeat amplified by anticipation. Miss Marple smiled faintly, knitting needles clicking in quiet rhythm. "We have considered each person's possible motives, anger, old grievances, disputes over property, rivalries long past. But motive alone is insufficient. Opportunity and character must align. And when we consider human behavior, the hesitation, the concealment, the anxiety revealed in gestures too small to be noticed by casual eyes, the picture becomes clear." Miss Marple turned toward Mr. Aldridge, her gaze steady and kind. "You arrived recently in Little Hemsby," she said softly. "You observed, as all newcomers do, the subtle currents of village life. You noted the minor tensions, the unspoken rivalries, and you acted, not in temper, but in careful calculation, believing that no one would detect what you had done." A faint gasp escaped Mrs. Pennington, and Mr. Carrington's hands tightened around his chair, though Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, almost conversational. "You removed the envelope, intending to conceal the contents. You misdirected suspicion toward Mr. Carrington, believing his temperament would make him an easy target. And you sent the anonymous note, knowing that fear and curiosity would manipulate the villagers' perception of events." Aldridge's face paled, his lips parted, but he said nothing. Miss Marple continued without haste, observing every subtle reaction. "Your actions were deliberate, patient, and observant. You understood the importance of appearances and relied on the assumptions of others to obscure the truth. Yet the small details betrayed you. The adjustment of furniture, the manner in which you avoided certain glances, and, most importantly, the reaction to subtle conversation intended to provoke recognition." She turned to the assembled villagers. "It is a remarkable example of human cunning, but as always, the truth lies in behavior, not in words alone. The combination of the missing envelope, the careful orchestration of misdirection, and the deliberate observation of the household allowed you to commit a deed and manipulate suspicion simultaneously." Aldridge finally spoke, his voice trembling. I only wanted to protect myself. "I didn't intend." His protest faltered under Miss Marple's calm scrutiny. "Intent is irrelevant," she said softly. "The consequences are not measured by intention, but by action. And your actions, though clever, left traces. The careful observer can read these traces as easily as words upon a page." She stepped closer, her gaze gentle but unyielding. "You believed that human nature would always favor assumption over insight. Yet the smallest details, the scuff on the floor, the missing envelope, the subtle adjustment of furniture, revealed your presence. And children, whose observations are often disregarded, provide corroboration where adults fail to notice. Clara Wainwright's account confirmed the movements you hoped would remain unseen." Aldridge sank into a chair, his composure broken. I did not mean for it to go this far," he murmured. His hands shook and his eyes were downcast. The villagers exchanged glances of shock, some relief, and some lingering disbelief. Miss Marple, returning to her chair and picking up her knitting, allowed the moment to settle. It is always a delicate thing to observe human nature. Often, the most subtle gestures reveal the deepest truths. And in this case, the secret kept by candlelight, though carefully concealed, has been illuminated by nothing more than patience, observation, and understanding of character. The room remained silent, the revelation having landed with quiet finality. Sergeant Wilkinson, who had been observing discreetly, stepped forward to take control of the situation while the villagers processed the unmasking of the true perpetrator. Miss Marple, ever composed, allowed herself a small sigh of satisfaction. The threads had been carefully untangled, and the picture, now complete, revealed the intricate weave of secrecy, motive, and human behavior that had led to the crime. As the afternoon light shifted, illuminating the drawing room with a soft, golden glow, little Hemsby seemed to breathe more freely, though the awareness that one among them had orchestrated such deception lingered. Miss Marple, knitting in her corner, reflected quietly that human nature, with all its subtleties and contradictions, was the ultimate canvas upon which truth could be read, if one only took the time to observe. The revelation of Mr. Aldridge's culpability had settled over little Hemsby like a heavy yet cleansing rain. The villagers, initially stunned, had begun to process the intricacies of deception, observation, and human nature that Miss Marple had quietly revealed. The Fitzroy estate, which had felt tense and unsettled for days, slowly regained a sense of order, though the shadow of recent events lingered, like the faint scent of smoke after a candle has burned low. Miss Marple, sitting in her familiar corner of the drawing-room, observed with quiet satisfaction. She had always found that the resolution of a mystery did not erase the human tendencies that produced it. Secrets would be kept, tensions would simmer, and small deceits would continue to shape the rhythm of village life. Yet in this case, the threads had been carefully untangled, and the village had been spared further calamity. The villagers, though still whispering in cautious tones, had begun to offer gestures of gratitude to Miss Marple, their respect mingled with awe. Mrs. Fitzroy, once tense and anxious, now allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "I cannot thank you enough, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "It is difficult to believe how much you observed, and how quietly you guided us to the truth." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. "It is merely a matter of noticing what is overlooked, Mrs. Fitzroy. People leave traces in their words and actions, subtle indications of intent. One only needs patience to see them." Mr. Carrington, still recovering from the shock of being suspected, approached her with a mixture of relief and curiosity. "I must confess," he said, "I did not expect the solution to come from the calmest corner of the room. I had assumed the loudest suspicions would prove true." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is often the quiet observer who sees most clearly, Mr. Carrington. The loudest voices often drown the subtler truths." Meanwhile, Sergeant Wilkinson had begun the process of formally questioning Mr. Aldridge and gathering the evidence that Miss Marple's observations had made evident. He moved with diligence, noting the envelope, the slight disturbances in the west wing, and the corroboration from Clara Wainwright. Each detail, small in isolation, formed a cohesive narrative under Miss Marple's careful guidance. The children of the village, including Clara, were celebrated quietly as unlikely heroes. Their innocence and attention to detail had revealed movements and actions overlooked by adults, a reminder that observation requires no age, only attentiveness. Miss Marple, sitting beside Clara, offered gentle encouragement. "Never underestimate what you notice," she whispered. "Even the smallest detail may carry significance beyond what anyone expects." In the days that followed, little Hemsby settled into a tentative rhythm. The Fitzroy household restored order to its routines, though Mrs. Fitzroy remained slightly more guarded than before, aware now of the delicate balance between trust and observation. Mr. Carrington resumed his usual walks through the village, though his steps carried a touch of humility learned from suspicion misdirected. Miss Marple, meanwhile, spent her mornings quietly in her own home, reflecting upon the events that had unfolded. She considered the layers of human behavior, the ways in which small actions and concealed motives could intertwine to produce such elaborate deception. She understood, as she always had, that the desire to manipulate, protect, or mislead arose naturally from human complexity. And yet she also recognized that truth, however concealed, could always be discerned by careful attention to character and subtle signs. Visitors continued to arrive at the Fitzroy estate, curious to discuss the recent events. Yet Miss Marple preferred her solitude, observing the conversations from a distance, quietly knitting while noting the interactions. She found it instructive, as always, to witness the careful reconstruction of normalcy, the cautious restoration of trust, and the ongoing negotiations of social life in a small village. One afternoon, she received a note from Mrs. Pennington, who had taken to writing her reflections in neat, precise hand. "It seems," the letter read, "that little Hemsby will never quite be the same. Even those who are innocent have been reminded of how easily appearances may deceive." Miss Marple, smiling softly as she set the letter aside, understood precisely the lesson it conveyed. The village's memory of the events would linger, tempered by relief, curiosity, and a subtle awareness of human nature's depth. The local newspaper carried a brief report of the resolution, though without the full detail that Miss Marple had deduced. The account was factual, noting the apprehension of Mr. Aldridge and the investigation of the estate. It did not capture the quiet genius of observation, the small clues, or the unspoken revelations. Miss Marple, as always, remained content with the subtlety of her work being unacknowledged by the wider world. Recognition, she knew, was never the point. Understanding human nature was its own reward. Even the natural rhythm of the village adapted to the aftermath. Gardens bloomed, church bells rang, and the market resumed its cheerful bustle. Yet beneath the surface, there was an awareness, subtle but pervasive, that the seemingly ordinary could harbor complexity, and that observation, patient, careful, and nuanced, remained the key to understanding. As evening fell over little Hemsby, Miss Marple lit a candle and sat by the window, the flickering flame casting gentle shadows across the room. She reflected upon the events with quiet contemplation. Each villager had revealed something of themselves, whether through hesitation, word choice, or subtle gesture. Each action had carried significance, and each secret, though briefly concealed, had ultimately been illuminated by careful observation. She considered the lesson that human behavior offered, that small acts, long overlooked, often accumulate into consequences far greater than expected. Yet the resolution had been achieved, and the village, though changed, would endure. In this, she found satisfaction, not in the exposure of the culprit, but in the understanding that human nature, in all its complexity, could be read with patience, insight, and careful attention. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted gently to the quiet of her own home, to the knitting on her lap, and to the rhythm of a village life restored, even as secrets remained, tucked away like whispered confessions. The candle burned low, and she allowed herself a faint smile. The secret kept by candlelight had been revealed, yet the lessons of observation, patience, and understanding would remain, guiding her insight into human nature in all the mysteries yet to come. The days following the revelation of Mr. Aldridge's culpability unfolded with an air of quiet solemnity. Little Hemsby had resumed its familiar rhythms. The postman delivered letters with the same punctuality, the market bustled with cheerful chatter, and the church bells rang on Sunday mornings as though oblivious to the tension that had gripped the village just a week prior. Yet beneath the veneer of ordinary life, an awareness lingered, an understanding that human nature, for all its civility, could conceal motives both clever and dangerous. Miss Marple, as ever, observed the world from the unassuming vantage of her own home. Her cottage, nestled among flowering hedgerows, provided a sanctuary where she could reflect upon the intricacies of the human heart without distraction. She sat by the window in the late afternoon, a small flame flickering in the candle beside her, knitting quietly while listening to the distant murmur of village life. In the stillness, she considered the events that had unfolded, the subtle deceptions and the delicate balance between observation and action. It had been an intricate case, more so than most, for the perpetrator had relied not on brute force nor on any impulsive whim, but on careful calculation, subtle misdirection, and an intimate understanding of how appearances could be manipulated. Aldridge had believed that the innocence of others, combined with the predictability of human assumptions, would shield him from scrutiny. Yet Miss Marple knew, as she had always known, that truth manifests itself in the smallest of gestures, a hesitation, a glance, a subtle adjustment of posture, a shift in tone. Even Clara Wainwright's observations, innocent though they were, had provided critical insight. The child's wide-eyed curiosity had revealed a movement near the west wing window that adults, in their hubris, had failed to notice. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she recalled how carefully she had orchestrated the final test, watching each suspect with patience, gently guiding conversation and observation to provoke the telltale reactions. In this way, the truth emerged naturally, without force, without accusation, revealed by the very behaviors that the guilty could not suppress. The village, for its part, had reacted predictably, yet humanly. Mrs. Fitzroy had regained a measure of composure, though her hands occasionally betrayed lingering anxiety when certain topics arose. Mr. Carrington, whose temperament had initially drawn suspicion, now walked with humility, aware that outward behavior could invite misjudgment, and Mr. Aldridge, removed from his ordinary life, faced the consequences of his actions, aware at last that cleverness without moral grounding carries its own cost. Miss Marple reflected upon the nature of secrets and the human desire to control perception. She thought of how minor resentments, unspoken rivalries, and buried grievances had combined to create a landscape in which a single calculated individual could manipulate the assumptions of many. Yet she also understood the resilience of ordinary observation, the unnoticed attentiveness of neighbors, the innocence of children, the patience of those who watch quietly rather than speak loudly. All these small factors had conspired to reveal the truth. In her solitude, Miss Marple considered the ethical dimensions of human behavior. The capacity for deceit, though powerful, is not absolute. It is always subject to the scrutiny of those who observe with patience and discernment. The moral of such observation, she mused, is not merely to expose wrongdoing, but to understand the subtle currents of human nature, why people act as they do, what compels them to conceal, and how the interplay of motive and opportunity shapes outcomes. Even the broader village had absorbed lessons from the events, though perhaps unconsciously. Conversations now included more careful listening, more attention to nuance, and a recognition that the outward appearance of calm or civility does not always reflect the interior realities of human hearts. Gossip persisted, of course, but with a tempered caution, a recognition that assumptions may mislead and that the truth often lies hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple's mind wandered briefly to the candlelight that had illuminated the drawing room during the final revelations. Light, she reflected, is both revealing and gentle. It casts shadows, but also allows clarity. So too is careful observation. It can illuminate secrets without harm, reveal intention without accusation, and disclose truth without arrogance. This, she thought, is the art of understanding human nature, an art that requires patience, empathy, and discernment. As evening fell, the gentle glow of the village lanterns reflected in the windows of cottages along the narrow streets. The sounds of daily life continued. A distant dog barking, the soft footfall of a passing neighbor, the occasional carriage rumble. All of it reminded Miss Marple that life in Little Hemsby, like in all villages, is a tapestry woven from countless small actions, hidden motives, and the quiet vigilance of those who observe with care. Her knitting rested momentarily in her lap as she allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. The case, though concluded, had offered a lesson not only to the villagers, but to herself. That understanding is derived not merely from confrontation or accusation, but from the patient study of character, the careful noting of gestures, and the recognition that truth is often revealed by those who believe themselves unseen. In the silence, she thought of the candle, flickering yet steady, illuminating only as much as necessary. So too, she reflected, must one illuminate the truth of human nature, gradually, gently, and with unerring attention. The secret kept by candlelight, once hidden behind careful manipulation and subtle deception, had been revealed, leaving the village wiser and herself, as always, quietly contemplative. Miss Marple rose slowly, placing her knitting aside. She moved to the window, gazing out at the hedgerows and the soft glimmer of lanterns along the village paths. Life would continue in Little Hemsby, as ordinary and unassuming as ever, yet forever altered by the recent events. The lessons of observation, patience, and insight, however, would remain, guiding her understanding of human behavior in all future mysteries, however hidden or complex they might be. And as the candle burned low, casting long, gentle shadows across her cozy sitting room, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. The human heart, she mused, is rarely simple, but with quiet attention and careful observation, its secrets may always be read.